Good afternoon, everyone. It is fantastic to be back here in the QE2 Centre near the beating heart of British democracy. A few private eye readers in the crowd, I think. All right, I just want to get a little bit of a sense of the audience that we have here today. So I've spent 15, 16 years now focused on sustainability and climate at Verdantix. Let's just do a bit of a sense check. Who's been covering sustainability in your role for less than 3 years, if you could help me out? Great, welcome to the movement. That's fantastic. Who's been covering these topics for 3 to 8 years? Okay, there's some mentoring and coaching that can be done. And who's been in the sustainability world for over 10 years? Oh, my friends. The sustainability survivors, as somebody who I've known for many years said to me a couple of years ago. So we know the sustainability survivors. What do we know? We know that really the 2010s were a lost decade. I'm sad to say, but the last 4 to 5 years have been incredibly exciting. Massive amount of investment, change, and we've just seen it in the audience today. So many brilliant new people like you getting into the sustainability movement and wanting to have a positive impact. So that's really good. The first study we ever undertook at Verdantix was to look at the FTSE 100 and try to find out how many FTSE 100 companies had one person who had sustainability in their job title. So this was in 2008. And if I remember correctly, it was 27%. Okay? So that helps you understand the progress that we're making. But what about the future? What are the future trends that we see at Verdantix as the 50 analysts or so we have powering away every day, uncovering things that are going to change? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I've picked 4 major themes to maybe help you think about what you should be doing in your business, what you should be elevating to the executive level. Maybe things that are important for you to get more budget, more resources, or to move your career forward. So here are the 4 topics I want to talk about. Digital automation, holistic climate risk, mandatory disclosures, and organizational reboot. And I think it dovetails really nicely with the strategic themes that Courtney was just talking about. So I'm going to talk about the first thing, which you could almost say we thought was going to be a positive, but it turns out it's becoming a bit of a negative. And what we're increasingly hearing when we talk to heads of sustainability around the world, and we survey 400 heads of sustainability every year, is that compliance has now become the #1 priority. And a lot of budget is being sucked away from the exciting, innovative, impactful projects that you want to do, and it's all being pulled over to meet EU CSRD compliance or UK energy and carbon reporting, mandatory reporting. And even new things that, in a way, we're in favour of, but have become a compliance requirement. Just last month, the UK launched the biodiversity net gain requirement for development projects. So this is almost the kind of, we thought it was a silver lining, but it turns out to be a bit of a cloud. And the reason why, I think, is it's having a bit of an impact on the sort of strategies that we see CEOs think are realistic to pursue. So the reality is there are firms out there who are kind of actively opposed to the sustainability agenda. And this is really drawing on our research in terms of what do we find from interviewing CSOs, what kind of strategies they see. There are firms like, say, Koch Industries in the US, who spend millions every year campaigning against a wide range of climate, environmental, and sustainability policies and regulations. So this is a real thing. What's happened is we're seeing firms having to become compliance-centric. Very few organizations have big sustainability teams, don't have big budgets. And so, as I was saying, a lot of the focus has switched to being compliance-centric. And that has implications for you, and also implications for people in EHS, which we find is the number one function who are trying to help you out. Now, what we advocate for is companies should be stakeholder aligned. So how can you have this debate internally and kind of wrestle the agenda back from the compliance, the risk, the audit teams and say, look, I get it, we need to do compliance, but that cannot just be the number one priority for us. We need to satisfy our stakeholders who expect us to do more. If you're lucky, you may have a CEO who actually, he gets it or she gets it, and they think, well, we're going to give you the budget to really figure out how to do this as a competitive advantage. We want to be the best in our industry on sustainability topics. And then, of course, where we all want to get to is industry transformation. And that would be companies like, say, Impossible Foods, where their whole mission is about getting meat eaters to eat plant-based burgers as a means to stopping climate change. So it's really interesting, if you check out Impossible Foods, 90% of the people who buy Impossible Burgers are actually meat eaters. And that's what they're trying to do. They're not trying to sell plant-based burgers to vegetarians. Really interesting point. Or in the UK, a company like GridServe, who are trying to have the best EV charging network, so transformational businesses. Okay, so this is what we would like to do, and I would encourage all of you to really think about your executives. You know, where are they thinking? How can you get them to stop being compliance-centric and move them up to a higher level, and a higher level of ambition so you can have more impact? Well, okay, what's the flip side? We are seeing quite a big crackdown happening around the world for companies who are not achieving suitable compliance with increasingly tough regulations. So you had this example where 30 police officers turned up at the Deutsche Bank Asset Management HQ a couple of years ago, and the CEO lost their job. Okay, brilliant story. The whistleblower was the Chief Sustainability Officer. I love that. That's powerful. Another example for you in the US, where even on, if you think, pretty basic environmental compliance issues, you're seeing some whopping fines come out, where you have a regime who are trying to move the dial on this. $180 million fine is pretty big. In the UK a couple of years ago, 30 companies were fined £29 million for failings on their mandatory energy and carbon reporting by the Environment Agency. I wouldn't fancy being the sustainability manager who'd screwed that up. But there are other examples when we look at the kind of social agenda, and some of these stories, I think, just slip under the radar, where you're looking at something like equal pay and a historic inability to comply with some of those regulations. So let me just kind of wrap up this section with a couple of final points. What we're seeing is all of these regulations that, in a way, sustainability folk has been in favor of, are taking budget away from you, and then you're having to have different conversations, because the regulator comes along and said, well, I need this accurate, assured, enterprise-wide data. And the CFO say, don't look at me. I don't know anything about, what does TCO2 mean? What is a lost time injury frequency rate? I don't understand. And so they then call the sustainability people, like, oh, yeah, I'd love to help you. This is fantastic. And then, the sustainability people have to get in touch with all the people at the operational level. And so we really think, and this feeds into one of the other topics I want to talk about, this whole idea of organizational change and improving your governance. Now, before I go any further, I have some fantastic news for the people who have been taking photos of my beautiful slides. You are welcome to continue, but if you are a sustainability practitioner, which is probably a lot of you, you can access Verdantic's content on a complimentary basis. Okay? So you won't be able to get these slides because that's not part of it, but I've drawn on a lot of our research, so hopefully that might save a few finger blisters. All right, so let's just finish up on this checklist to keep aligned on mandatory reporting. You have to look at what's going on, with investors, even if you're not a listed company, because investors and lenders are really focused on these topics now. Banks are starting to integrate climate and sustainability questions into their lending decisions. So even relationship managers for a small business may be having questions if you're, say, changing something relating to a building. We're seeing a lot of developments around double materiality, especially if you work in a EU headquartered company. This will be an essential thing to understand and how it applies to you. Again, CSRD compliance, if you're an EU firm, there will be something similar in the UK. And then IFRS is aligning with a lot of the EU regulations. So IFRS will apply to UK firms due to the accounting frameworks that you follow. In other words, you have to take this seriously, you have to know about it, talk to people in finance and accounting, make sure you look smart with them in terms of what's going on. Okay, next topic, holistic climate risk. And I think we heard a great question earlier on about, flood risk and are companies doing enough on this? Well, our research indicates that, per the question, there's very weak controls around most climate risk topics. And, I think all of us can think about, some of the horror stories that we've seen. I don't know if anyone's been affected by a wildfire in their life. Certainly, I was once on an island many years ago in the Med, and there was a wildfire, and it's incredibly scary. You have to pack all your stuff up and literally be ready to move in the middle of the night. We've seen shocking floods of truly historic proportions all around the world, whether it's in Vermont or Beijing. Chronic problems with the Panama Canal, which suddenly everyone realizes the lock system is dependent on reservoir water, and with changes in rainfall patterns, suddenly you don't have enough water. And so there's some interesting adaptation stories there. In Switzerland, what could be more iconic for the Swiss people than their glaciers? But as they are melting so rapidly now, that resulted in the Swiss Glacier Initiative and a whole portfolio of new climate regulations. So you can see the kind of impact on voting because then they pushed a referendum through. The Rhine, I actually mentioned this to somebody in America. They paid for a summer trip to Germany, and then most of their Rhine River tour was actually completed in buses because there was so little water in the Rhine. And of course, that's a major industrial artery as well. And then, the shocking fire on the island of Maui, where over 100 people died. Now, one of the things that I see with this, the challenge with this sort of climate risk, is what I would call the tragedy of the locality. And what I mean by that is all these things are happening in different places, but if you're not in that locality, how does that really affect you? If you weren't on Rhodes on holiday, you were in Sicily, you were fine. We don't live in Maui, so, okay, there was a fire there. That's unfortunate for them. And I think this is why we're not seeing a strong enough response by businesses and voters to these issues, because it's all so local by definition. But what we want to do at Verdantix is really help people understand holistic climate risk as opposed to just the headline-grabbing stuff around wildfires, floods, changes in rainfall patterns. And this is really intended to help practitioners like you have a more kind of comprehensive discussion internally and say, look, you may have been affected, you may have been on holiday in Tunisia or Algeria or, Egypt where there's been a fire. Okay, this didn't impact our business, but actually the three other segments of things that you really need to think about. Industry transition risks. you can see the problem that you have with German automotive manufacturing now, where they're so worried about the impact of BYD, and they're so worried about the impact of Tesla. You know, what does electrification of the automotive sector mean? Emissions intensity risks. People don't necessarily think about this as a risk. But with the way regulations are going, what if you are the most energy-intensive chocolate producer? Is that a problem? Well, you know, that is going to be in the public domain. And equity analysts, investors, lenders are going to say, well, you know, for whatever reason, you are going to have to accelerate your net zero transition plan. So we have all of those intensity risks there. And then increasingly, you know, we're seeing this crackdown on any kind of greenwash. And so there's a real need to be extremely careful in terms of, you know, the compliance of, you know, not just your financial reporting with GHG data, but adverts, and going through an assurance process with this. If you are someone who's talking internally about climate risk, don't focus exclusively on those physical climate risks, because I think what you'll find is people don't engage with you enough. And this kind of ties back to the point about the data that you have. It's not just kind of one pressure point that your organization is going to be facing. If you are a larger organization that operates in the EU, then you will have to do CSRD compliance reporting. Investors like State Street want this data. In some cases, there's like quasi-compliance from organizations like S&P. And then there's also now a whole range of snooping technologies. And I'm sure some of you have seen media coverage of you know, some of these huge methane leaks, and then companies are being named and shamed in the media because you have huge amounts of CO2 equivalent. I think it was something like 3.5 million tons from a leak in Turkmenistan. In other words, you know, a lot of risk around all of this data, and no doubt 85% of you here are still using spreadsheets for everything. My final point on the climate risk topic is, of course, it then does intersect with other elements of sustainability and ESG. So it's an environmental risk, but increasingly we're seeing it have a safety impact, not just on, you know, citizens on holiday, but also it could be your workers who are exposed to heat or exposed to extreme weather. All right, let's move on. Organizational reboot. As I was saying, the first study that we did at Verdantix, FTSE 100, around 27% of firms had one sustainability employee. 15 years later, organizational reboot. Why I'm saying that? Well, okay. Can anyone put up their hand? Who works in an overstaffed sustainability function? Right, doesn't exist. Perfect point. So we all know that. I mean, it's incredible how small sustainability teams are and what the load is that is put on your shoulders. So well done to all of you. And with all of this compliance work coming through, you know, there's this need for an organizational reboot. You are massively under-resourced, and we want to help you get more budget and more great people into your teams. So, you know, what do we see going on that is maybe a positive around this? So this is from our annual survey of 400 heads of sustainability. CEOs are more involved in sustainability strategy than they have ever been. This is really great news because you don't have to go with a begging bowl to the CFO. You can engage with CEOs who have that ambition. They say, we need to do the stakeholder engagement. We want to compete on sustainability. And then it makes it a much easier conversation. So that is moving in the right direction. I think the other thing that comes out a lot as we do research on EHS, on real estate and built environment, we do work with people in operations and engineering, is who are your friends? who are the operational groups who are kind of joined at the hip with you and maybe share some of the vision and values. Environment, health and safety always comes out top in these surveys. Like, who are you leaning on? Who can you work with the most? They have great expertise. Finance, didn't used to be on that list, but they are now. And then you can see some of the other operational groups. I think it's really important to have great relationships with those operational teams as part of your reboot. And then you can see, this is from our survey that we do with around 300 heads of EHS, and they're keen. They see themselves as very much participating, supporting, even leading on a lot of the initiatives that you're involved with. So just to kind of wrap up on the reboot bit before I go into the final section, what is all the work that you're doing? What are the new demands that are being placed upon you, and how can you present that in a way that says to people, this is unrealistic, and also it puts the business at risk because this is now part of our financial reporting. Look at these fines, look at Deutsche Bank, look at what the UK Environment Agency has done, look at what's coming down the pipe in the EU CSRD. Talked already about the operations people. And then the other thing that I think can really help you is benchmarking. Find an organization in your industry who's got twice as many people as you do and say, well, how can it possibly be the case? The CEO is saying, we want to compete on this, and I've got half the number of people, half the resources. All right, let me wrap up with my final point around digital automation. Historically, we know that you haven't had the support that you need to digitize your workflows, to digitize your data collection, to have that kind of shiny technology platform that you can go and talk to people here on the second floor about. But as we move into compliance, as this becomes more complex, as the risks of this information being not just inaccurate, but late, become much bigger, you will have to digitize your processes. We're not saying boil the ocean in terms of where you need to go, but it's clear that there are 3 processes that you need to focus on. You have to do the kind of core ESG and sustainability reporting because you have all these different audiences. You never know what people are going to ask for. You need that kind of business intelligence capability. You cannot do it with spreadsheets. The next piece is around carbon management. As we are seeing companies go from reporting on carbon to then reducing emissions, you are spending money based on that footprint data. It has to be correct. You need to do hotspot analysis. Where are your opportunities? So again, you need to have really good quality data. It can't be what I used to see at the end of the year. It was produced around 220 days after the end of December. That's just not going to cut the mustard. And then the other area where we're seeing surging demand for better quality data and engagement is around supply chain assurance and risk. The good news is if you are looking for this type of software, this is one of the things that we do at Verdantix and have done for years. Believe it or not, the first ever time we benchmarked carbon management software was in 2009. Okay? So this is not new software. It's the fact that the market hasn't been there. So if you need ESG reporting software, if you're looking at carbon management software, I think some of the companies like Watershed are upstairs today and Wolters Kluwer, go and talk to them to find out more. You are going to need this. One of the things that we find is people in sustainability roles are not familiar with the capital requisition process of their companies. So you suddenly need it, and then you realize you needed to start talking to people about 15 months earlier than you did. So I would recommend, trying to find someone who can coach you on that process. The good news is, for anyone who has been through this, if you position it as a compliance project, it's far more likely to be above the line. And then the final area that I recommended there is around sustainable supply chain, Many of you probably have to do EcoVadis type returns. We have to do that at Verdantix as well. We're silver, working to get to gold. And just thinking about some of the data that you may need about suppliers, both kind of from a risk point of view, reputational risk, as well as looking at materials, components, and ingredients. So that's all for me. I think we've got time for questions. And as I said, if you're a sustainability practitioner, you can access our content, and this is how you would do it. So just check out Vantage on our website, because we're here to help you and help have a positive impact.
Thank you, David. Really entertaining session. Does anyone have any questions from the audience? If you do, please put your hand up. Is that hand behind the live sign? Just next to the E. Oh, there's one here as well.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Really good talk. It's John here from GRI. I had a question for you around the mandatory reporting. Do you have positivity that the pain and effort and work, I guess over the next 2 or 3 years, will actually lead to some meaningful change once we've got over the adaptation and preparation for the requirements that are coming?
Yeah, I do think so. So, I mean, let's just take the easiest data set. So if you look at climate data, that 12,000 firms will have to report in about a year's time in the EU. So what is good about that is that it is going to immediately be analysed by all of the financial data providers like MSCI, like S&P Global. And what that will do is it will shine a spotlight on all of the firms who are underperforming. And all of the things that I think for years people have been able to say, well, we didn't manage to get our Italian and Canadian data. I mean, all of the stuff about inconsistencies will have gone away. And so if you like, what's going to happen, we think, is there's going to be much more name and shame, and there's zero wiggle room for companies to say, well, this is not comparable. So it's comparable, it's aligned with financial reporting, it's gone through limited assurance. And one of the things I love, I don't know if there's anyone here from CDP, but the CDP have aligned their voluntary reporting with the EU framework. So it's like compliance through the back door. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because then you've got even more data about climate disclosures, which is going to be in the same format, although the CDP can't force people to assure it. So I think it will actually have an impact, not necessarily encouraging the firms who are doing well to do anything different, but I think that bottom 20% is going to be really bad news. And nobody knows, if they're going to be in that group or not.
I love the way you smile when you say bad news. Just one very final quick question from the back, please, and a quick answer, please, if you could, David. Thank you.
So thank you, David. My question goes in a direction to the tools themselves. So what we see as a big challenge is not the aspect of consolidating the data and visualizing it and creating nice dashboards, but it's actually what's happening before and after. So before, in terms of really how we get in the data, and afterwards is how we can use it also for predicting what we need to do in the future, like forecasting. So what do you see is with the platforms or the tools which are out there to also internalizing machine learning and AI into predictive tool, or predictive modeling and all of this? Because so far, I don't really see this out there.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, what is amazing about the carbon software market is it existed 15 years ago. So sadly, it's not necessarily a new concept. I mean, effectively, I think I agree with what you're saying. You've got all of the analytical capabilities. You can do forecasting. You can build different transition plans. The huge issue is, how do you get the high quality data into the system? And I think this is where the penny hasn't really dropped with a lot of organizations. And the forcing factor is these regulations coming through. Of course, if you have enough support, you can absolutely make that happen. One of the things we think is going to happen is it will be outsourced. So you will find a large firm like a Capgemini, like an Accenture, and say, look, we don't have the people to gather all of this data. We want to have a 7-year deal with you, we need to hit our 28% reduction target in 7 years' time, and then you're on the hook to gather the data, make it happen, and apply all of the assurance around it. So it's not an insoluble problem. The issue has just been that the resources haven't really been provided to companies to do it. And you're right, AI, could certainly help with some of the estimation.
Thank you, David. That's all we've got time for. David Metcalf, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.